Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet. Sadly, still wrapped in a pandemic. We had a race to create vaccines that have been developed. They're not getting into arms nearly fast enough to ensure a smooth path back toward something you might describe as normal. It'll never be what we thought it was. We'll be doing a lot more of this kind of screen gathering, regardless of what happens with herd immunity. And our sessions here on this webcast, Sustain What, are designed to drive us forward in conversations toward better outcomes than we might have without those conversations. Fridays, I tend to focus on media of various kinds, including film. And today we're going to talk about Spaceship Earth, which is a documentary that launched just before, I guess, just as the pandemic was spreading, before we realized it, at Sundance, and has made the rounds. It's gotten a lot of interesting reactions. It's about Biosphere 2. We live in Biosphere 1 here on this planet. This remarkable and audacious experiment in the desert in Arizona that had all kinds of lumpy learning curves, had a spectacular backstory for how it became about, that Matt Wolf has described in this film, which draws on hundreds of hours of archived material. We're going to talk about this today from several lenses. The key one is, what can we learn from this sealed experiment that still exists in a very different way, that can help us navigate toward more sustainable outcomes in our lives outside of bubbles. And we're all been living in a bubble of one kind or the other, particularly this year. We have two students from the MFA program in film here at Columbia University. We have a graduate who wrote an epic piece exploring Biosphere 2's last chapters, its history as it became part of Columbia University. We have Matt Wolf, the filmmaker, who has a great career early in his career and is going great places going forward. And Kimberly Springer, who is from the oral archives part of the library system here at Columbia. This webcast today is sponsored by the Oral History, co-sponsored by the Oral History Archives at Columbia, the Columbia University School of the Arts, and the Interdisciplinary Center for Innovative Theory and Empirics. INSIGHT is the acronym, and my initiative on communication and sustainability. I'm Andy Revkin. So we're going to get into this immediately, but first we're going to start to meet the guests. Today you can see here to my adjacent to me is Kimberly Springer, whose background is in oral history, and we'll learn a little bit about that and how that relates to what Matt has tried to do. You know, any documentarian is always drawing on material that exists, as well as building new imagery. We have Ben Eckersley and Andrew Golden, who are pursuing master's MFAs in film, both of whom have interesting connections to these questions around climate sustainability. And Arminda Downey Mavromatis, who's now at Chemical and Engineering News, if I'm correct, in a job similar to one I had at the very beginning of my career as a journalist. And it's exciting. I was at Science Digest magazine as an assistant editor in 1983. So good luck to you going forward into the new world of journalism as it exists today. Good to have you all here. How are you all doing? Kimberly, how are you doing? What's it like to be an oral archivist these days?
There are lots of projects of people trying to document COVID oral histories. So
right.
I think we're building up the archive for our hopeful future of reflection on the period.
We should do a whole session on that, actually. A colleague here early on at the Center for Sustainable Development, she and a colleague of mine did a webinar for students, like middle school students, on how to be radio reporters, or whatever you would like to call it, audio reporters. And there's so much potential to record what's around you and have it be meaningful for generations to come. Really important work.
Definitely.
And we're going to circle to Matt in a second and start talking about the film, but I just want to get a brief sense of the others here too. So Ben, I met you when Kim Stanley Robinson, the science fiction author, was coming to town face to face here about a year ago, right? It was in February, 1 year ago. Boy, things have changed. So could you just kind of quickly give a thumbnail of your filmmaking vision and how it relates to what we're talking about today?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, great to be here. Really like this film. I used to study ecology and also economics, and I'm very curious about how to kind of bring those bigger issues, particularly the issue of climate change and how it affects us economically and ecologically, but putting it into a narrative lens, and how that affects real human beings, not just us in aggregate. I haven't really figured out how to do it,
Right.
but it's something that I'm really interested in. I mean, it's so interesting to watch this documentary about Biosphere and something that is sort of stranger than science fiction that actually happened, and the kind of parallels of that. But yeah.
Yeah, you couldn't. Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. But you think of the grandiosity of what played out and the vision of that obsessive crew that led to this. It is beyond James Cameron almost. Not quite. So Andrew Golden, you've been in journalism, video journalism for a little while. You were at Scientific American, done video journalism elsewhere, and you also have a strong interest in narrative, I assume, conventional narrative feature film too. So why are you here? I know a little bit of why you're here, but what drives you when you think about this film and your own work?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for having me. And that's right. I have a background in science journalism. I worked as a video journalist for Scientific American, and where I covered a lot of stories on climate and innovative technology. And a lot of themes from those stories actually make their way into my own written work in screenwriting, which is what I currently study at Columbia. And right, although I work in narrative film, I mean, I used to work in like a sort of mixture of documentary and science journalism. And so to see a film like this, I was just like, yeah, I was very intrigued.
Is it the backstory of Biosphere something that you had known about before, or was this a complete revelation?
Well, I happened upon the story of Biosphere 2 just reading science journalism, and I couldn't believe that I hadn't stumbled upon something like this before, having worked in science journalism. And something I was working on myself is actually adapting the story of Biosphere 2 into a narrative screenplay. And so that's sort of where my background in it comes. And, of course, I've read everything under the sun about Biosphere 2 at this point. And yet this film still sheds a lot of light on aspects of the story that I had no idea. So it's exciting,
For sure. And Arminda, what led you? I'll show the piece you did, and then we're going to just briefly describe your context for your interest in this. But what led you to even? You wrote like a multi-thousand-word feature story on Biosphere 2. How did that come about? Just a quick sense of that. As an undergrad at Columbia,
Absolutely.
Barnard.
I originally was looking at the different campuses that Columbia has, looking at Lamont, looking at the planned expansion for the Bismarck, as part of a separate article for The Eye, which is the magazine of the Columbia Daily Spectator, when I came across this idea of a campus in Arizona. And that, to me, was totally out of left. I've never heard of Columbia having any involvement, really, in a full-on campus outside of New York. And the more I looked into it and read about the story of Biosphere 2, the more I realized this was a really compelling narrative, not only about Columbia's search for identity, but also about scientific institutions, experiments, and the limits of conducting those experiments in such a spotlight and doing something so unorthodox.
Yeah, I highly recommend this story. Folks who are watching, or later on, if you go to the links in the homepage for this event, you'll get a link to that story. So now we're circling forward to the film itself, and Matt, hold on, let me just bring us back here. So Matt, as a filmmaker, you especially documentarian, you have this incredible palette of possibilities, right? The world is immensely interesting right now and has been for decades. So what what pulled you toward this particular project?
Well, as a filmmaker, I'm really interested in hidden histories, and people you could call unconventional or even problematic visionaries. And most of my films draw from very substantial archives, a huge amount of archival footage. And I did not recall or remember the story of Biosphere 2, but while doing archival research, I came across these striking images of 8 people in bright red jumpsuits standing in front of a glowing glass pyramid, and I thought they were stills from a science fiction film. And quickly, of course, realized that this was real, and these 8 people had lived inside Biosphere 2, and I was determined to tell their story when I learned that so many of its participants were around. But as I learned about this kind of unconventional countercultural prehistory to the project, that really sparked my interest. And, I went to the ranch commune that this group of people called the Synergists live at. And at Synergia Ranch, I was brought into this climate-controlled closet that had hundreds of 16mm films and analog videotapes and thousands of images that had been meticulously collected but never had been seen. So, that really is the trifecta for me, a story that's faded from collective memory and unprecedented archive, and participants who are around to tell their own story in a kind of present tense first person way. So, that's what led me down the Biosphere 2 rabbit hole.
Yeah, but actually, can we talk a little bit about Recorder, which it blew my mind. I hadn't realized you had made that film, and just give your thumbnail sketch of Recorder, because it's so relevant right now with our screen time that we have.
Yeah, Recorder is about an activist named Marion Stokes who recorded television 24 hours a day for 30 years on multiple channels, and created a fairly comprehensive archive of media. But she was a mysterious woman with a very unexpected biography. She was reclusive and became fabulously wealthy after investing heavily in Apple Computer very early on, but earlier in her life had been a radical communist, and had a very prescient and almost futuristic view of the role of television and the media in shaping public discourse and opinion. And so now, looking backwards, we see the incredible insight she had despite the maddening nature of her personal project. So I drew upon 700 hours of material from her tapes, which is a tiny fraction of what she captured, and through those who she left behind, her family of her son, and also a chosen family of assistants, she led a very unconventional life and was laser focused on this project.
Well, and this relates to Kimberly's passion for archiving, for capturing the information that creates our realities. Maybe we should do another session on that film sometime. But what I learned from that film was also that you think of TV, even back in live TV days, you assumed it was being recorded and sort of kept somewhere, but it turned out that was not the case, right?
Completely. And I think, I'm drawn towards these private archives or anti-institutional archives, which is very much a thread through Spaceship Earth. This is a group of people who operated outside of the scientific or academic or government mainstream and pursued a project as a private venture, which they obsessively documented on their own terms in a way that's a counterpoint from the mass media's more carnivalesque treatment of their project. And, when I met this group, I asked, why did you film so much? And they said, what we were doing was making history, and it was important, and we wanted to capture it. So as I did with Marion Stokes, I felt a huge sense of responsibility to really reappraise the history that they were a part of, which had, for the most part, been discounted as this kind of spectacular failure.
Right. So let's show, Kimberly, I don't know if you had a thought about what I just was saying about the stuff that flows by that we don't really think about saving or documenting. And then I'm going to show the trailer for the film, and we can talk a little bit about the details of this wacky story.
Yeah, just briefly, because from what Matt said, like I think I watched the Marion Stokes film first when the pandemic started, and then Spaceship Earth came out. And then I sent Matt what was probably like a weird fangirl email of just loving these films, and was shocked when he wrote me back. So thank you. But yeah, I love this approach because Matt's talking to people who are conscious about making history and how they save that history. Like, it's not only the film canisters, but they were in a climate control room, it sounds like. So these are people who are very cognizant of controlling and shaping and preserving the archive means you're going to control the narrative story you tell later.
That's such an interesting challenge. It's kind of like an archaeologist, I guess, Matt, when archaeologists and paleontologists see the fossil record, and we know that the fossil record or the historic record in archaeology is like a fraction of a % of the full picture. So that must be...
I mean, a lot of the work I do, I would characterize as translation. A lot of my subjects did projects that had a certain level of complexity that was difficult to comprehend as they were working. And these were people whose ideas were unconventional, who weren't necessarily able to articulate in a super concise and explicit way what their mission statement might be. And so, drawing upon the incredible raw material that they had the foresight to preserve, I do act sometimes as a translator to create a sense of narrative coherence to the ambition of people who did things that hadn't been done before.
So interesting. Well, I'm going to show the trailer right now, and then we'll get to some discussion here about the film, and we'll hopefully get some comments in from the audience. Hold on 1 second here. I'm just right, here we go. Can you hear it?
No.
You're not hearing it? Hold on a second. Of course, I set it up the wrong way. I'm still learning the back end of all this stuff. Hold on. Let's do it with the sound. Actually, while I'm doing that, Ben and Andrew, if you have a quick filmmaker question for Matt, chime in while I'm just getting this fixed.
Yeah, well, I'm curious about, this astounding amount of archival footage, something like 700 hours of archival. It was fascinating to hear about what you see as the responsibility of the filmmaker as a sort of translator or archivist. And I'm just curious, looking through this footage, did you have a sense of the story you wanted to tell right off the bat, or maybe at what point in that process did you realize, like, oh, this is the story I want to tell?
It's a little bit of both. I think I go into every film having a set of ideas and a narrative that I'm interested in telling, and then I pivot around the raw material that I have access to. And I will say, when you work with that volume of archival material, it's a collaborative effort with a team. And those collaborators are looking for compelling material that is the kind of golden tickets inside of these huge corpuses of material. And I build the narrative around those things sometimes. I prepare my interviews to set up extraordinary material, but at the same time, I'm looking for things that support a larger narrative that track the experience of subjects in the film who I'm interviewing potentially, or sometimes just track a cultural history in a way that is hard to understand through visual representation. I'm very interested in simulating the passage of time, which is a kind of interesting opportunity with these types of archives, but it's always a balance of, organized chaos and control, I would say, in filmmaking, allowing chaotic things to present themselves and having a system or a process to manage that material and to shape it into a narrative.
Okay, so let's have a quick look here, and hopefully I got it set up correctly. Just wave your hand if the sound is not on.
As I look at Biosphere 2 and I'm ready to enter, I take my last breaths of this atmosphere for 2 years.
We were pioneers. We were the first Biospherians.
How can you prepare yourself for journey into the unknown?
A biosphere is a closed system with plants and animals and the atmospheres all inside. We called it Biosphere 2 because Biosphere 1 is the Earth.
If we're going to go to Mars and the Moon, we better know how to make a biosphere.
Climate change is a threat. We were trying to counteract that threat. We put in a rainforest, a desert, and an ocean with a living coral reef.
It was a global curiosity. 8 human beings separated from life. I don't know any innovative human organization that doesn't have cult-like aspects.
We called ourselves synergists.
John Allen was a very good leader.
He was a mind musician.
Here is your brainwashing cult leader.
The 8 Biospherians are now quarantined together.
The negativity started.
Fighting is taking away from us accomplishing our objectives.
That set off alarms to me.
I don't want to talk about it.
Members took part in strange costumed rituals.
John Allen was having paranoid delusions.
Things were falling apart.
There was something to hide.
And this really shocking thing happened. There's a sudden spike in CO2.
We were suffocating and starving.
It was not legal.
Everything that could go wrong went wrong.
Here is this capsule of life from Earth. It was science fiction without the fiction.
This is an incredible moment. The future is here.
So the future is here in so many different ways. You know, having lived hermetically these past years, of course, this past year, we've all been sort of biosphered.
Want to know where to invest?
Maybe a quick round of
right
reflections
now?
just on
Hi,
that
Rex
before we
Moore
get
with
into the
Combine
specifics of the film. Does this resonate to that level too? When you think about our current predicament on the planet, I'll start with Matt and then maybe Arminda. What resonates related to the theme here?
Well, I mean, this film was made and premiered before, our quarantine. And then that happened, and the film was released shortly after, I think, because the distributor and we saw an opportunity to tell a story that was kind of hyper prescient in a completely, uncanny way. Fortunately, that timeliness didn't kind of overtake the conversation around the film, but I think, yes, it was obvious that to an extent we were biospherians ourselves. And I think the way I often frame the conversation is looking at what the biospherians said when they re-entered Biosphere 1 is that, they no longer could take anything for granted. In a small system, everything you do counts. You can literally measure the impact you have on your world, and that transforms your sense of accountability and impact on the larger system that we all live in on Earth. And, I hoped at that time when the film came out that people would not return to normal, but to imagine a new normal in which they had a heightened sense of the interrelated consequences of our actions and how we might deal with our world differently. A year later, I don't know if that's going to be the case, but I think in some senses, Biosphere 2 is a utopian project, and that utopian projects often don't go as planned, but I think we have an opportunity to reimagine the world in the same way that the Biospherians reimagine their own miniature world as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are feeling that right now. What can we get better than we had in the run up to the pandemic that let it sort of spread and disrupt?
Or how did the conditions of our world and the way we treat it manifest in something that also is a prelude to catastrophic climate change? And right. In what ways can the shift of perception in our kind of daily experience help us become more cognizant of a situation that's inevitable in which our daily lives will be transformed?
Arminda, having dived deep into the backstory, what comes to mind for you as lessons that resonate more widely?
I think when I was watching the film, one thing that kept coming to mind was that the people at, the Synergy Ranch and the people who were in the biosphere, the biospherians, were really concentrated on the power of small groups. I thought that was interesting when you actually look at the way the pandemic has changed science. At least I've found that it has made science less about small groups doing important things and more about enormous groups of people, huge collaborations that move science forward. I also found interesting that it sort of showed to me the difference between flashier projects like the Biosphere, this grand structure, all of this money being poured into this project versus the more realistic incremental work of the sciences. And it was, at least in my understanding, that incremental work of the sciences that Columbia at a later point was hoping to work on within the biosphere until they realized, of course, that the biosphere, because of its costs and because of its trappings, was a lot more about theater than it necessarily was about science.
Interesting. Yeah, that's always a balance. Everyone in science is trying to attract funding too, and you end up sometimes in traps where that funding priority leads to a need for a narrative. We are going to solve X, that can lead to false trails. And so Ben and Andrew, maybe to take on the film itself again in that sense of what are some other questions that come up about how the story was told, or does this resonate for filmmakers too?
I'll jump in here. Yeah, I mean, actually, maybe to just add on to kind of thinking about it in the COVID sense, or not. Like, I first heard of Biosphere as an ecology student, kind of in passing, as this like boondoggle, and something that was really interesting to hear in the film that I really didn't understand before was kind of its communal origins and this sort of social experiment stuff that I just had no idea about. And where I sort of wondered about a parallel with, current stuff with COVID was that it sort of seems to be kind of stuck in this, when it came out, it was stuck in this kind of like spaceship, kind of utopian imagination about what we could do with a closed system, when the way that climate change was being framed at that point in the early 90s was very divergent from that. And in the same way that now with COVID, I'm sure that when we all sort of come back together, the issue of climate change is still here, just as it was then, and it's getting worse. But, how is that going to sort of rejig us in a new way, away from kind of the fundamental work that needs to be done? And I was wondering, maybe for Matt to elaborate on, they do make those passing mentions to sort of that they were aware that climate change was such a big problem. And obviously there are these parallels with the increasing CO2 within Biosphere 2 as it was happening. But how much were they actually thinking about climate change when, they sort of engaged in this project? I mean, it's after sort of, James Hansen's testimony in Congress, and it's right around the time of UNFCCC. I don't know if it started before or after, but that's the sort of conventional framing as we have climate change today. But were they actually thinking about that, or is that just ex post rationalization when they explain it into there now?
I think they were thinking about it, and I think they were thinking about a lot of things all at once, sometimes to the detriment of their project and the reception of it, but that it is many things at once. I think this is a group who traveled around the world on a concrete junk ship that they built themselves to pursue ecological and cultural projects around the world, almost taking on, the planet and its biomes piece by piece and synthesizing that lived experience into this monumental project. I think there was a desire to demonstrate sustainable living, and that there was a theatrical but also educational component to that on the world stage. But at the same time, the economic rationale for this project is that it was a pilot for space colonization, and that they would pioneer green technology and also technologies that could, lead towards, closed ecosystems on another planet. And then, within the biosphere, they pursued, scientific experiments that were based on a total systems approach, where they observed an incredible amount of data and measurements and collected that material to better understand how a closed system works. They had intended for Biosphere 2 to be a 100-year experiment and to see how this system evolved and what they could learn from it, in a sense, to understand atmospheric dynamics within the larger system of Biosphere 1. And then, of course, in the context of the mass media, this was a human experiment that in some ways showed the complexity of 8 people living together, quarantined, and how they had to overcome interpersonal conflict to make the system that they designed and created themselves into something in which they could, subsist. So again, as a translator, a lot of my work is to make sense of something that has so many layers, but also something that other people didn't understand, because all of the overlapping intention and all of the overlapping goals of the project. It's much easier for us culturally to appreciate and understand projects when they have a coherent mission statement, which I think I said before. And this is a project that had many missions all at once. And I think it is important to look at the broader consciousness of climate change now and to put it into context for the early 90s and late 80s, in which there was not broad awareness of that. In fact, when this group pursued the project, the term biosphere was not part of popular vernacular. They had to explain what a biosphere was. So I do think that environmentalist sensibility was at the core of the project, but I don't think that, counteracting or contemplating solutions to climate change was at the center of its mission.
One thing that strikes me about the film is, that was around when Coca-Cola had that advertising. Maybe that was earlier, we are the world. It was kind of like a global picture. And the people who went into the biosphere weren't really a good picture of the world.
No.
In terms of race and geography, you would have thought an ideal version, especially because it grew out of the 60s counterculture of, which expressed some of those aspirations. Of course, we're looking at it after the fact, so it's hard to get at that aspect of the story, but it seems to be something that jumps out now.
I think that actually speaks to the homogeneity of the Back to the Land counterculture movements of the early 70s and late 60s, in which people tried to escape the trappings of an oppressive world, but, created new communes and geodesic domes that, in fact, reified some of the power structures that already exist. And Biosphere 2 is no exception to that. And it was striking to me that so much of the mass media around the project never made any discussion or comment about the homogeneity of the group. I think, in fact, one news report called it a diverse group. So I think there is a kind of post-colonial analysis to be carried out about the film. The whole project was about colonizing Mars. They built an enormous ship and sailed around the world doing projects in other cultures. So in a sense, that kind of political and cultural lens was clearly not part of the discourse of the counterculture, and certainly not of the mass media in the early 90s.
Yeah, I'm just going to show, this is the other angle that, of course, resonates right now, where Elon Musk just became by far the world's richest man. And he's in this battle with Virgin and Amazon. They're all trying to hermetically seal themselves off in a way. This idea that this journey for humanity into space is for all of us feels sort of fantastical. And that, I don't know how that resonates with folks here. Any comments?
That was
I will say
question for. Oh, my question for Matt, just related, because there's that clip, I guess it's a news clip that says they're ethnically diverse. And I remember taking notes and being like, what are they talking about? So was the purpose of that clip to...
Well, every time I don't know if this lands for everybody. Every time I heard that clip, I would just laugh out loud. I thought, I thought, it's interesting when you make a film, you want people to ask certain questions at strategic moments. So for me, when I was crafting the film, at what point does the viewer say, how are they paying for all of this? And then you deliver that. And I think for me, I was like, at what point are people being like, okay, these people are creating a new future, but they're all white. And that felt like the moment to say that. And I found an incredible, part of the challenge of the style of filmmaking I do is I try not to bring in kind of contemporary experts or critics as much to interpret and analyze the material, but to allow the raw material itself to do that. And that was a challenge with this film for sure. But I did find this clip of these like amazing Brooklyn teenagers, who I think mostly were Black teens who were like, what would it look like for me in the biosphere? It was like amazing. One of the best clips in the film. So, I was surprised that there was less commentary on that than as there would be now, of course.
So, Arminda, I think you had a thought a minute ago when we were. What was on your mind?
I did. I saw in the film, and I think you see in the story of the biosphere generally, this idea that there are very wealthy people who are putting a lot of money into escaping this Earth and escaping the problems that arguably they've created on this Earth, and creating a new world that is not necessarily for all of us. Instead of taking that money, the biosphere, they talk about the enormous cost to both make it and sustain it. I found myself wondering what could have been done that early on, in the 80s and in the 90s, to take that money to study ways in which we could, reduce ozone depletion, or have helped a lot more people than the idea of a biosphere or of a new world on Mars.
You cut out a little bit, but I think I got the gist of it. Basically, as I understand, the question is like, to some extent, it's problematic for kind of spectacular and epic projects like this to, consume so much resources. And in fact, stratifying those resources and working on more sustainable projects or small scale experimentation might have more worldly impact. And I think that's a valid critique of Biosphere 2 for sure. I think one way I put it is bigger isn't always better. And in a lot of ways, the film is meant to be a cautionary tale. And that this group had quite a bit of success as a small group working on scalable projects around the world. They had incredible savvy and tenacity in realizing things that hadn't been done before, that they didn't have the skills to do. And I found that kind of outsider scrappiness to be really appealing. But when they scaled up, things spiraled out of control. But I think about that with filmmaking in general, as you know, as the film students know, it's a lot. It takes a lot of resources to make a film, and all of these resources could be spread towards smaller creative and cultural projects. But nonetheless, I do think it's important for people to pursue wild, imaginative, spectacular, and epic projects. I think there's a lot to learn from them, and also that we have to honor and cultivate that kind of imagination and aspiration and ambition. I think for the most part that manifests in a capitalist kind of entrepreneurial model, which only further extracts resources from our planet. But that I do think that the kernel of that inspiration to think huge, even though what they were doing was making a miniature world, is important. But the pitfalls of that is that its impact may be very relative to its cost.
That whole, I think it was Ben who said that early story, how this came about and its roots in counterculture. That blew my mind. I could have lived in that first part of the film for hours. I could have seen it as like a series almost. There's so much depth there. And the way that came about, that cultish, you could call it cultish or Pied Piper aspect of the early entrepreneurs is stunning. Was that
Yeah, I
hard
mean, I'm really interested in the connection between, and Fred Turner, the scholar, wrote a really seminal book on this, the connection between counterculture and cyberculture. I'm trying not to use the word neoliberal as much because I think it's becoming less and less specific. But in a lot of ways, that is the trajectory of neoliberalism, the kind of utopian imagination manifesting into capitalist projects. And what I found so striking about this group is that they identified as capitalists. The organization that they had, which I think Ben was speaking about his interests in these themes, is the Institute of Ecotechnics. They wanted to create projects in which ecology and technology could combine in ways that were both ecologically and economically sustainable. A term that might be more appropriate than neoliberal is conscious capitalism, a kind of icky Aspen Institute type rhetoric. And I think, like, you know, that was the aspiration of this project. But in the late 80s, it predates .com culture, in which, you know, this group was perceived as a cult. That's not my perception of them. It was a cult of personality surrounding an individual, charismatic individual who had the ability to raise an incredible amount of private capital to pursue his project and to push people to achieve things they hadn't done before, which 100% is the ethos of Silicon Valley. So
Sure.
in so many ways, Biosphere 2 is a kind of prototype for disruptive .com culture, and so much of the way people are thinking about managing climate change, which I'm no expert on, is conscious capitalist models of carbon suppression, et cetera. And so, you know, it's worth noting also that the financier of Biosphere 2 is the oil scion. So there is a kind of mea culpa aspect to someone whose enormous wealth is from fossil fuel extraction becoming a huge environmental philanthropist who wanted to pursue a very ambitious ecological endeavor.
I think I can't tell. Arminda, did you have a question too? I saw a fresh note in the chat box, but maybe that was from before. Yeah, you know, the Steve Jobs had, as you were saying, Steve Jobs had all the same qualities. Even Bill Gates in the early days, they were in terms of attracting attention and having a vision that was way too big to actually achieve. But then,
well, and I think there's a conversation about failure. What kind of projects is failure conceived as a stepping stone to innovation? What kind of capital is behind certain projects in which failure is part of its design? And I think, and this may speak to Arminda's work, that to me, you know, Biosphere 2 has certainly had been rebuked as the spectacular failure. And obviously my film, to some extent, is an affectionate portrait of the ambitions of the project, although it also looks at its limitations. But I think that the ultimate failure of Biosphere 2 is that it's not being and stopped being designed as the instrument and apparatus that it was designed to be. So much intention and rigor went into making it probably the most hermetically sealed structure of its time, and created all sorts of innovative models of doing that. But when Columbia University got involved, you know, the closure was breached and the individual biomes were isolated to do small scale scientific experiments. And so to me, that's the ultimate failure of Biosphere 2, is all of its design isn't and hasn't necessarily been used for what it was intended for.
But turning to the filmmakers again, the young filmmakers, let's just step back from this particular film and thinking about maybe spend a couple of minutes on what it's like to be a filmmaker right now and completely talk about disruption. The entire concept of the film industry as we knew it has exploded, and now it's sort of figuring its way forward. How does that affect where you would go if you were going to make a film? Let's say you wanted to dig in on the early days aspect, take one aspect of this and make it into a film. What does that feel like right now?
Well, I mean, we're doing a lot of writing these days. Not too much shooting. But But I mean, yeah, there's something super inspiring about this countercultural, moment that inspired building something so sort of lofty, and I feel like if I were to start thinking about how to narrativize this, I guess it would just involve doing as much research as possible. And, of course, distributions just changed like crazy. I mean, I was able to watch this film opening day from the comfort of my couch,
Right.
It's something that I suppose is going to be the name of the game as theaters. There's no sort of plan of reopening theaters, but yeah, I guess just working from home and figuring out what aspects of the story interest me and how to do the research necessary to narrativize it. I don't know, how do you feel about that, Ben and Matt?
Well, I certainly, it would be a good time to be, cutting something archival. Right?
I guess that's true.
I'm trying to be a narrative filmmaker. But I think, yeah, I mean, totally what Andrew said. But I guess on top of that, the silver lining is that we have all this endless time to reflect about what we're doing so that we can be more intentional about it. And, a story like this, you could see, not to throw Andrew's project under the bus, but, you could imagine that somebody could sort of cursorily hear about this and then pitch it to some Hollywood studio and make some movie that really doesn't engage with it. Whereas, now we have more time to think about why we're telling the story that we must tell, and maybe pick the best way to do it. And it might be a documentary, it might be a narrative film, but there's time to slow down and I think about the kinds of movies that really should be made instead of just churning for a content wheel. Although I think that's pretty nicely still.
Yeah, maybe Matt, and then Arminda's back. You might have had, I think your connection was a little iffy there at one point. But Matt, I mean, you're continuing to make more films, and when you think forward, has this been a good time to, when you think generally about the film business or the documentary part of it, has there been value in this great pause? We're all in a great pause here. We were in great acceleration mode for 50 years on this planet as a species. You think this will come out better or different? I guess it'll always be different.
I don't think the project of filmmaking is dead by any means. And I'm able to work. Fortunately, so much of my work is research intensive and archival driven. But to me, I'm interested in making films that look at the past and that make old things feel new and to show how they resonate in the present. So at a time of incredible historical complexity and paradigm shifts, that is creatively generative for me. I made a film during quarantine that's all archival material about a controversial self-help figure in the early days of the AIDS epidemic. So it's been a generative time for me, but there are obstacles and challenges to doing things the way that they used to be done. And I believe that creative people have always been tasked with working within constraints, and that the constraints now are probably more elaborate than they have been in the past, but that we are able to make things with limitations.
Arminda popped off again. I'm not sure what the technical problem might be there. Kimberly, I wanted to reflect on the archives themselves. Again, we kind of take them for granted. I think that stuff is, now we're so swamped with imagery and sound. Think about January 6th, how the Democrats have been able to assemble this narrative in a space of weeks to present, and BLM last year and what we have here at Columbia. Just how are we underinvested in that? Are we underappreciating what needs to happen there to make that, all that information useful in a rational way?
Yes, we are.
Is that your job?
I'm on my high horse lately about the invisibility of archival labor, for one thing. That things like all of the materials from January 6th didn't just, magically get taken off of someone's phone and put onto a hard drive somewhere and preserved appropriately. Like, there are archivists who are doing that work, and they're generating metadata to make these things findable and discoverable in a lasting way. So that's one aspect. But then there's also, I think, for creators, and for a lot of people, researchers, there's the assumption that everything should be digitized, and that's not necessarily the case, because there might be legal restrictions or ethical implications for doing that. And there's also just a whole archival discourse around the politics of digitization. So whose materials get digitized and whose materials are deemed worth saving. So there's a lot of different conversations happening at the same time.
So interesting.
Yeah, and that's part of what I'm interested in, is participating in that labor of identifying things that beg to be known, particularly when they're invisible in plain sight, and using my skill set and deploying the resources I have from filmmaking to preserve and make visible archives that might not otherwise be seen or known,
Mm-hmm. I love that you use the word translator, because I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about being an intermediary between the archive and then what the output is, which is different than, I'd say, some researchers who approach the archive and like to say they discovered something in the archive. Well, it was cataloged, so clearly you didn't discover it. And then it creates a particular kind of narrative. So I think the framework that creators bring to the archive is really important for how it gets used.
And I think probably the difference between what you do and I do is there's a particular metaphor I use of a subject, for instance, oral history of a particular era, is a boulder. And what I do, and probably what you do to an extent, is use dynamite and blow it up into a million little pieces and then organize that stuff in some sort of index that's accessible. For me, it's for the purposes of the edit. For you, it's the purposes of public knowledge. And I think what I do is I take great pleasure in organizing that material and making sense of something chaotic and overwhelming, and then being able to pick up those little pieces and to reconstitute in something that has a kind of shape and style of its own. That's where I depart from being an archivist and into being a filmmaker, an artist. And I think that process of taking things that are abstract and or monumental and breaking them down into components is sorry, there's music. Sorry, Andy, there's music playing.
Oh, sorry.
It's the score. But
I thought you were getting played off like the Oscars.
I think
I was trying to silence it.
I was 52 minutes in. I guess we're ending. But
the entire thing.
I think I was I remember revising that music cue. But it's interesting. Yeah, is ultimately, and this is true of Marion Stokes. It's creating the index. The corpus of material is not of value until the index is created and people can find meaning within the body of material. And the archivist's work is to open up the possibilities for things that are to be discovered and unknown from my point of view. And my job is to take that material and to interpret it, as is the work of journalists, activists, historians, and scholars.
There's so many layers to this conversation, in the sense of the material that went into making the film, the shaping of the film, then the issues that it raises. We have a few more minutes. Let me show one little, I was trying to queue up another section of the film there. I'm going to show that. And Arminda, it's good to have you back. Sorry about the technical issues. So hold on one second. And let's see if we can make this work. We'll hear what that soundtrack was for.
If we're going to go to Mars and the moon, we'd better know how to make a biosphere.
A nice, simple definition that I like of a biosphere is a virtually closed system with plants and animals and the atmospheres all inside. If we're going to build the first human-designed biospheric system, we're going to make it beautiful. We're going to put in mini rainforest, a desert, the savanna, be an ocean with a living coral reef. would be populated by hundreds of carefully selected plants and animal species, including 8 people. We called the project Biosphere 2 because we wanted people to say, well, where's Biosphere 1? Biosphere 1 is the Earth.
It certainly is. So maybe a last round of thoughts here before we close out with, if there's a sequel to do starting where we are now, we have these grand plans that they're billionaires and trillionaires are creating. We have in Singapore, there's a sealed environment, this Gardens by the Bay that I got to visit a few years ago, where you're sort of in a biospherean situation. And the thing it made me realize as I was there, 80 miles from the equator in a giant sealed dome that had the environment, the climate of the Mediterranean. There were like oregano bushes and olive trees 80 miles from the equator in Singapore. The thing that resonates always is that issue we talked about earlier of justice. Not everyone's going to live in that glass sphere. The same year I was lucky to be in Nairobi and spending time in a couple of the giant slums there, like literally same position around the equator, same moment in history, completely different story. I don't know, what are the stories to tell right now going forward that can capture and build on what you've done here so far would be interesting to me. So let's start with the young folks. So Arminda, you're in the magazine world now, Chemical and Engineering News, which I'm sure covers things like CRISPR and the genetic and chemical technologies that are going to take us forward for battery design and the like. Where do you see, what's the big story that you would like to capture? And then we can just go around the room here and close things out. It's been good to have you all here.
I would love to see some sort of film about renewable energy and about the different projects that have been done and I think, very social discussions about, wind power versus solar power versus coal versus nuclear, and the way that interplay happens both in the media, in the demonization of some of those energy sources, but also just in the sort of public mind, knowing that we need sustainable fuel going forward, trying to figure out what that is, and all of the groundbreaking research that's being done both in the United States and around the world.
And Ben?
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to tell stories about the kind of environmental changes happening right now that can avoid just being about, the boondoggles and the silver bullet solutions. Yesterday it was a biosphere, now it's geoengineering, carbon recapture, all these kind of crazy things that people talk about. And because, I think the story of the biosphere also very aptly showed how quickly people get used to new conditions that can be incredibly damaging and even, mortally dangerous. The transition that you did to them getting so emaciated was great. How you sort of made that visual progression, because it really talk about shifting baselines. Those are harder stories to do. And I think, the Biosphere film also, that was a point where I really empathized with them, that, everybody was just sort of sniffing for the scandal within the boondoggle, instead of actually trying to kind of take it on its own terms. So how to do that? I don't know. It's less sexy, but.
Yeah. That's that searching for the narrative. The sexy narratives are easy. Andrew, if you could just hold on a second, there are some questions that came in from the audience that I just popped up, and I wanted to make sure we got to them too. Katie Kim this is for Matt. Is there particular value in telling a scientific story? If so, why? I mean, you've told many kinds of stories. What's particular to the science story?
I don't have a particular interest in telling scientific stories. I gravitate towards material for ways I don't fully understand until I'm inside the film. And this one happened to be a scientific story. To me, I was drawn to it for its themes of unconventional visionaries and hidden histories, and also the act of reappraisal, which is so interesting to me. But I think something I'm very interested in is making ideas emotional, creating an emotional interpretation of big ideas. And science is an intellectual pursuit, and I think there is a need to create an emotional relationship to the inquiry of science, whether it's a sense of wonder, a sense of concern, or of admiration for innovation and discovery. I think I'm really interested in films that traffic not just in narratives and characters, but also big ideas. And I think the way that we remember films and form relationships with them is when they compel us to feel something. So I no matter what, would love to see science films that do that for me as a viewer.
For sure. And Joshua Herrig asks, "Hi Matt, speaking of the archives, were there any parts of the archive restricted you from seeing or showing by the subjects? Were there blinders on what you could dig out?" And he also had another question. I'll just give you both parts. Conversely, were there parts of the story you wanted to tell but couldn't because of time? I would imagine there isn't a filmmaker on the planet who doesn't want to tell more.
Totally. And I chose to focus on this prehistory as a significant part of the film, and not just to make the experiment and mission its focus. There's a complex afterlife to Biosphere 2 as well, and that wasn't what I focused on. I really tracked the journey of this group of people who conceived of the project. And in terms of archival restriction, there wasn't anything in particular that was restricted, but it's always a bit of a dance, to be honest, between gaining access and trust to use underlying material that's been collected and captured by your subjects, and editorializing that with a certain level of journalistic independence and autonomy. And I think it's a dance, and it's an element of building trust and setting intention that's clear. So I think, I couldn't take certain material out of context that might make them look insane or crazy. I, in fact, didn't want to do that, but certainly could have. And so there's, I would say it's a question of fairness. Like, what is the fair way to treat your subjects, but also what's the fair way to use their archives? What's a fair way to appropriate something and to give it context so that it does not distort meaning in service of my narrative?
So interesting. So Andrew, where do we go from here with storytelling around issues like this?
Yeah, well, something I thought, I love that I saw in the film, and that I'd love to see in more films and hopefully my own work, is just, in sympathizing to some degree with the synergists that, in the way that the film does, it suggests, rethinking our communal politics in a way that I feel is necessary given the times. As we sort of shift the burden of interplanetary travel almost exclusively to these billionaire industrialists, a personal worry of mine is that we just start to see the same problems that we see on Earth now with our current material reality on these other planets. And unless we radically rethink the way that we structure our society, and, whereas the synergists might not suggest the best collective politics, or even, a relatively functioning communal politics, to rethink them, I feel, is a sort of necessity that our times really demand.
Yeah, there's this concept. There was a book that I think it got turned into like a Nat Geo style documentary a few years ago called "The World Without Us." We essentially did a thought experiment. What if humanity was wiped out? How long would it take all of our edifices and everything that we created to deteriorate? What would happen to everything? And I wrote around that time, the harder book to write, and maybe I'll just say the harder film to make, is The World With Us. What is because it's complex, and it's, doesn't have necessarily a neat and clean narrative, and it isn't stark like just saying humans vanish. What's that look like? So that's, I think, one of the challenges I feel right now is how we tell the story or build the story of the world with us. And it's got to be inclusive, including who's telling the story. And maybe it's more about a conversation than a story, even, different observations of one archive or one moment or one situation in conversation around ownership or directionality. And that's going to be a challenge with the way modern media work because of the polarization that's implicit in the internet, and working against those aspects of things seems really important. Kimberly, last word from the world of archives. I was going to ask you, like, what's the story that isn't being told that you know of that's sitting there just waiting to be brought to life? And so
I already called her trying to.
Oh, you did?
I won't mention anything I told you.
No, give it away.
Matt has dibs. What's a 70-year-old collection? So we have thousands of interviews with individuals, which there are just so many life stories there. The other day I was walking in Midtown and I saw a plaque on a building about Toots Shore Restaurant. And I was like, that sounds familiar. Yes, we have an oral history with Bernard Toots Shore in the collection. We also have a huge 9/11 collection, and we have a few interviews about Children's Television Workshop. That's definitely an oral history project that somebody could take on, because I think one of the interviews is in a film that was just in Sundance about Sesame Street, for example. So there's just all these like micro stories that are just there percolating, waiting.
Yeah, one of the upsides of the internet capacity, I keep thinking about the potential to have a layer on Google Maps or something where you just click this layer and it's sort of a discovery layer where you see the indigenous map pop up. Like, I'm in the Lenape territory here in the Hudson Valley, and we just, whatever's known about that could be just a layer you click. The slave burial grounds under Wall Street, we could have this. These stories can just be emergent around us with some capacity. Feels like a promising moment along with the challenges. This has been a great little discussion. Kimberly, I'm really glad you had the idea. And Matt, of course, I'm thrilled to connect with you and to connect you with the MFA students and with Arminda. I'm just going to show. So this has been a productive session of our whoops. Let's do this the right way. There we go. This has been a productive Friday afternoon session of Sustain What? And I hope everyone who hasn't seen the film can check it out. I assume it's still on Hulu, and now it's on Amazon, I think. Matt, where can people watch it?
Hulu, Amazon, iTunes, YouTube, all the kind of usual suspects of where you rent and stream films.
And do a watch party and just use it as a discussion point with your friends too.
Please. And thank you for hosting this, Andy.
Sure. So on Sunday, my Sunday shows are music and poetry. That's how I've stayed sane. I've developed a community of, I'm a musician too. So tune in Sunday for our, Valentine's Day edition of our, this Sustain What? Sunday Sanity. And then Monday, having a very different journalistic exploration. The Texas TV reporter, David Schechter, he does this cool show. It's called Verify, where he takes audience members on journeys to check out issues that irk them. And he took a climate skeptic to Alaska. He just won the big DuPont Columbia Award for this an innovative broadcast of sort of a learning journey with skeptics. So that's going to be on Monday at the time here. And then Wednesday, we're getting into the world of books with two of my favorite writers who happen to be friends, Betsy Colbert and Annabella. I was going to say Annabelle Lee. That's a line from a song. No, Annalee Newitz, who has written a book about what we've learned from 4 cities that no longer exist about where we go from here. So thanks again for being here today to my guests and to the audience. This gets archived right away on 4 different places. So share the links with friends. Get in touch with me using that distracting scroll bar at the bottom with ideas for future episodes or feedback on this one. And everybody stay safe. get vaccinated as soon as you can, and go forth into this brave new world. Break down the bubbles around you, and get into the archives around you too. Thanks again to all of you for being here today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy.